Company Man by Joe Maggio. And if that's not a clever pen name, there's not a cow in Texas. This is a very fascinating account of a somewhat fictionalized account of a contract mercenary of the CIA. This gentleman claims that he worked for the CIA and gives, again, kind of a fictionalized account of his time of being recruited and being trained and then put out into the field by the CIA, and then documents several of his assignments and things that he did. And I actually found this in an article detailing some secret CIA facilities, and they mentioned this book and said that he had just changed the name slightly of some of the actual known CIA facilities. And I thought, well, that's interesting. So I ran this down. Well, lots of good information about the workings of the CIA, again, if we are to believe Mr. Maggio's account here. Lots of interesting stories about that, of how recruiting is accomplished, and how these guys are put out into the field, how they're paid, their pay scale. Lots of information, but especially gets into the kind of person they're looking for, and to do this kind of wet work, as it were. Now, those of you who followed some of my other reviews about some of the occult crime and things like that, will find this next little anecdote very interesting. He mentions that he was trained, some of his critical mercenary kind of paramilitary training was carried out in a secret camp in the Florida Everglades. And he claims that while he was there, that a police officer in the area there, out in the countryside, caught on that there was some kind of suspicious activity, that this camp was being used for some kind of paramilitary stuff, and decided to look into it, got a little bit too curious for his own good, and some of the guys running the camp caught this police officer and put him into the through the propeller of a swamp boat, thus dispatching him rather violently. So the interesting thing about that, despite the fact that that is a terrible, horrible way to go, and is the fact that that was a paramilitary camp in the Florida Everglades, and this book was published in 1972. And that date is important because later on we find out, those of you familiar with the case of Henry Lee Lucas will know that, will probably remember that in his the book about his conversion in prison, called The Hand of Death, he mentions that he was trained and by a cult called the Hand of Death in the Florida Everglades, in an area reminiscent of what Mr. Maggio describes here. So really, really interesting, very compelling connection there. That could they be related? I don't know, but I do find that interesting. This came out in 72. Unless Henry Lee Lucas sat around reading this, who knows? But I find it interesting, both guys mention this camp in the Florida Everglades where they were taught wet work, as it were. So good information in this. Lots of very fascinating inner workings of CIA contract work. A lot of it is, and he says as much on the onset, that a lot of this has been changed to protect, sources and methods and that sort of thing. But really, really fascinating book. I highly recommend this if you're into researching this stuff. And that one little bit about the Everglades is troubling and possibly part of a bigger equation. So anyway, Company Man by Joe Maggio.